The autumn wind in Montreal had a way of carrying secrets. It rustled through the narrow streets of the old district, tugging gently at the golden leaves that clung to the maple trees lining St. Denis Street. The air smelled faintly of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor, and damp stone from last night's drizzle. Between a used bookstore and a florist whose windows overflowed with chrysanthemums stood Maple and Pine Cafe, a place Sophie Tremblay had claimed as her sanctuary for years. She was a literature teacher at a local high school, and Maple and Pine was where she graded essays, escaped with her poetry, or simply stared through the window at the rhythm of city life. The cafe wasn't glamorous. Its brick walls were lined with ivy, and its mismatched chairs creaked with age, but the warm lamps that glowed inside had always made Sophie feel safe, like a secret corner of the city belonged just to her. That morning, however, Sophie hadn't come for solitude or poetry. She came because her mother had insisted. Just one date, Ma Phil. What's the harm in one blind date? The word safe had come up in the conversation more than once. Safe sounded boring, but boring sounded better than betrayal, and betrayal was something Sophie knew too well. She checked her watch as the cafe doorbell jingled softly at exactly 10 a.m. Her blonde hair was tied into a loose knot, a beige scarf tucked neatly round her neck. She pushed the door open, scanning the room with a guarded expression. A part of her had already braced for disappointment. Another dull hour. Another man who would ask why she didn't take a higher-paying private school job. Another reminder of how her last engagement had collapsed under the weight of empty promises. Then she saw him. He was already seated near the window, where the morning light spilled across the table. A man in a worn gray coat, holding a crumpled paper bag in one hand and a battered paperback in the other. He looked up, his expression warm but unassuming. When he smiled, it wasn't the polished grin of someone trying to impress. It was soft, almost shy, as if he were surprised she'd actually shown up. "Sophie?" he asked, standing to greet her. She hesitated a moment before nodding. "Yes, and you're Daniel," he replied, offering his hand. "I hope you don't mind I got here a little early." His handshake was steady, not rehearsed. Sophie slid into the chair across from him, setting her purse down quietly. Everything about him felt unpolished. No flashy watch. His dark hair still carried the faint sheen of morning dew, as though he'd walked here instead of taking a cab. His voice was calm, deliberate, without the urgency of someone desperate to fill silence. "You read?" she asked, gesturing to the paperback. "Always," he said with a smirk. "Keeps me out of trouble." For the first time that morning, Sophie smiled, though her guard stayed firmly in place. She had once fallen for charm before her ex-fiancé had been full of it, and yet Daniel's tone wasn't charming. It was just real. They ordered drinks. Sophie asked for chamomile tea. Daniel ordered a black coffee, no sugar. "I like it bitter," he said. "Bitterness takes time to appreciate." Like most truths in life, Sophie arched a brow. "That's oddly poetic for a blind date." Daniel chuckled, a little sheepish. "Sorry, occupational hazard." "And what's your occupation, exactly?" she pressed, tilting her head. She wanted to know who this man was, or at least how he defined himself. "I work with schools," he said vaguely. "Funding and support services." Behind the scenes, mostly, it was evasive, but not in a slick way, more like he wanted the focus off himself. Sophie nodded, though part of her wondered why he had to be so careful with his words. Their conversation lulled, broken only when Daniel tore a piece of the cranberry scone he'd ordered. He leaned toward the window and tapped lightly against the glass. Sophie followed his gaze. Outside, a scruffy golden retriever sat wagging its tail, eyes wide with hope. Daniel cracked the door open and held out the crumb. The dog took it eagerly, then backed away, tail thumping against the bench. Sophie blinked. It was such a small, simple act, yet so unexpected. Most men she'd met would ignore the animal or worse, shoo it away. Daniel, on the other hand, fed it without hesitation, without seeking credit. When he turned back, he simply shrugged. "I pass him often. He's always hungry, never greedy." Sophie caught herself smiling before she could stop it. It wasn't much, just a crumb and a wagging tail, but somehow it felt more genuine than all the grand gestures her ex had ever attempted. "You like what you do, right?" Daniel asked suddenly, leaning forward. Yes, she admitted. But everyone asks when I'll leave public school for private. More money, they say. Why would I ask that? Daniel looked genuinely puzzled. If you love it, then the money doesn't matter. The words landed heavier than she expected. No one had ever framed it like that, not her colleagues, not her family, not even her ex. For years, she'd been defending her choice, justifying why teaching in a modest neighborhood mattered. But Daniel had said it simply, without judgment. And that, strangely, made her feel seen. They lingered a little longer, finishing their drinks. When it came time to leave, Daniel didn't push for a second date or ask for her number with rehearsed confidence. Instead, he simply stood, met her eyes, and said, "It was really nice meeting you, Sophie. I hope your day is gentle." Gentle. The word echoed in her mind as she walked back to her car. She had expected awkwardness, maybe even disappointment, but she hadn't expected gentle. For the first time in years, she laughed to herself, a real laugh, enforced, unguarded. Maybe safe wasn't boring. Maybe safe was the beginning of something honest. Montreal has a way of looping you back to the same places until you admit you're meant to be there. A week after the blind date, Sophie slipped into Maple and Pine on a Tuesday after last bell. A stack of essays tucked beneath her arm and the kind of tired that only teachers know hanging behind her eyes. The cafe looked exactly as it always did, lamps the color of late afternoon. Ivy pressed against the windows, the hiss of milk steaming. The bell that sounded like a small promise whenever the door opened. He was there. Same table by the window. Same worn gray coat, collar turned up like a habit. Same paperback, though this time the spine was so creased. It looked like it had survived a decade of backpacks. He glanced up, and the surprise that flashed across his face was so genuine that Sophie's instincts split in two. The part that wanted to retreat and remain sensible, and the part that was suddenly, inconveniently glad to see him. "Hey," Daniel said, lifting his cup as if it were a greeting. "Didn't know this was your time." "It rotates," she said, trying to sound casual as she slid into a table to down from his. "Essays wait for no one. Budget spreadsheets don't either," he murmured. Then, after a beat, "Do you want the window light? It's good for grading." Brutally honest. She almost declined self-preservation, had its own well-rehearsed script, but something in his offer was so ordinary, so unpolished, that she found herself nodding. He stood, gathered his things with a light clatter, and seated the seat like he was leaving a chapel pew for someone who needed it more. They didn't talk much that day. She underlined dangling modifiers and circled wandering metaphors. He scribbled into a battered leather notebook and checked a phone that hardly buzzed. When she rose to leave, he only said, "Gentle day, Sophie," and she left with the faintest smile, betraying her doubt. It kept happening. Friday, in the late lunch lull, when Maple and Pine smelled like cinnamon and quiet, there he was again, hunched over the notebook. The following Wednesday, after a staff meeting that bled into evening and scraped her patience thin, he was already in line, passing the barista exact change, and she noticed paying for the person behind him. After they came up short, Sunday morning, the street slushed with last night's timid snow, he sat with a book, a taqua pulled down over hair that refused to behave. Watching the window like the city outside was an unspooling film. The first 3 times, Sophie told herself it was coincidence. By the 5th, she decided Montreal was conspiring. By the 6th, she stopped arguing with geography. It wasn't dramatic. Whatever was happening between them, it was all small weights added to a scale. The way his voice dropped when he asked about her worst class, 9th grade. Eternally. The quiet concentration when he listened to her rant about a district policy written by someone who'd never met a classroom. The gentleness with which he slid a napkin across the table when her pen bled onto her thumb. He did not flirt. He did not perform. He was simply present in a way that made space instead of taking it. On a rain-polished afternoon, Sophie left the school without checking the sky. Montreal punished that kind of optimism quickly. The rain arrived sideways, needles of cold stitching her hair to her cheeks. At the bus stop on Rachel Street, her umbrella surrendered with a brittle snap. She stood there, damp and stubborn, refusing to let a broken hinge rewrite her day. "You look like you could use a second chance," a voice said behind her. She turned. Daniel, already damp, held out an umbrella that had clearly seen better years, but still knew its job. "No, I'm fine," she started, out of reflex. "Take it," he said. None of the insistence that usually soured a favor. "I'm heading 3 blocks. I can sprint. You'll get soaked. I'll heal," he said, with a grin small and sincere. Then, because he seemed constitutionally incapable of fussing, he pressed the handle into her palm and jogged away into the rain. Shoulders hunched, smile intact. Sophie stood there under borrowed shelter, and for the first time in too long, her chest tightened in a way that wasn't dread. She watched him until he turned the corner and disappeared into the silver veil of afternoon. The next day, the barista at Maple and Pine handed her a paper cup with a Sharpie scrawl, "From someone who appreciates quiet company. No name, no number." When she looked up, Daniel was at the window again, pretending to be surprised by birds. There were other things, small and absurdly specific. Her mother mentioned that a panel in their backyard fence wouldn't survive winter. Sophie added it to the mental list that adults make and then ignore. 2 evenings later, she came home to find new screws catching the afternoon. The panel straightened and braced. In the mailbox, a scrap of paper, loose screws tightened. "Should hold a year. No signature, just tidy block letters." She carried the note to the kitchen, stared at it long enough for the kettle to forget to boil, and told herself a neighbor must have done it. Montreal had helpful neighbors. She'd read that in a brochure once. At school, the annual book drive for students who'd never owned a book of their own turned the staff lounge into a cardboard archive. Sophie mentioned it to Daniel by accident, something about wishing for more chapter books. That didn't talk down to kids. Saturday morning, he showed up at the school gym in jeans and a faded flannel, carrying a box stamped with the logo of a long-defunct mile and bookstore. He didn't drop it dramatically or pose for gratitude. He bent, stacked, sorted, noticed a 7th grader hovering by the fantasy section, and knelt to say, "You can pick 2. No one will tell." Later, one of Sophie's colleagues leaned over the donation table. "Friend of yours?" she asked, eyebrow arched, voice pitched to the gentle gossip of teachers who see everything. "He's someone who keeps showing up," Sophie said, surprising herself with the warmth that rose in her throat. "You don't look like you want him to stop," her colleague replied. And Sophie had no retort that wasn't an admission. That night, the city felt softer. At home, she poured tea and fed Buster, who had adopted her after deciding her small apartment looked like a retirement plan. When the doorbell rang, she braced for a neighbor complaint or a parcel she'd forgotten she ordered. It was Daniel, standing on the porch like people do when they are out of practice, asking to be let in. "Chicken congee," he said, lifting a thermos and a plastic bag. "Not pretty, but it fixes most things." "A knot," she began, but her voice came out thin. The headache behind her eyes answered for her. She stepped back. "Kitchen's this way." He didn't narrate anything as he moved around her small kitchen, like he'd been trained by an auntie who valued quiet over commentary. He poured, found a spoon without rummaging rudely, and set the bowl into her hands as if it were a contract she could refuse. "I'll wait on the porch," he said, nodding toward the bench. "Eat while it's hot." When she reached to hand the bowl back later, his fingers brushed hers. She flinched, an old reflex from old harm, then blurted, "Sorry," as if she'd broken something fragile. "No worries," he said softly, and meant it. "I'll be outside." He sat on the bench, Buster at his feet like a monarch inspecting his subject. Through the window, Sophie watched him nod off, chin falling toward chest, then snapping back up with the stubborn dignity of people who refuse to admit they're tired. She made ginger tea, opened the door, and handed it to him with a whisper that was more than gratitude and less than confession. The city kept offering chances for Sophie to wonder out loud, "Who are you, really?" Each time, she let the question evaporate like breath on cold air. Asked too soon, and people either lie or leave. She'd learned that lesson so well it had bruised. On a golden Saturday, they wandered the Atwater market together because together had crept into their routine. Without asking permission, vendors hawked late-season apples. A busker tried to convince a fiddle to sound like summer. They chose pears with ugly skins and perfect scent. argued lightly about whether Leonard Cohen sounded like dusk or dawn, then split at a bookstore when Sophie got pulled into the poetry section, and Daniel claimed the nonfiction stacks with the focus of a student cramming for an exam. He'd forgotten to attend. Back in 10, he said, disappearing. He returned 20 minutes later with an apology and a paper bag of sesame bagels dangling from his wrist, fresh from a Site Denige's bakery. For recovery, he said. Monday at lunch, the principal walked into the staff room holding a brand new backpack. This was on my desk at 7 a.m., she said, confused. No note, just Liam's name on the tag. Liam, the shy 7th grader whose backpack straps had surrendered to gravity last week, went red as the maple leaf stitched to his hoodie. Inside the front pocket, a card for someone who carries more than books. No signature. Sophie didn't need Holmes to solve it. She turned the thought over carefully, the way you cradle a hot mug on a cold morning, warming. A little dangerous if you held on too long. By now she should have been suspicious. A man who appeared when the city folded into rain. A fence that fixed itself. Anonymous charity that knew names but refused credit. But the suspicion that used to save her from men who performed goodness now felt like a poor tool against someone who seemed to practice it. They sat on a bench in Park La Fontaine that evening, cups of takeout coffee heating their hands while a squirrel plotted to commit snack theft from a distracted toddler. You don't talk much about yourself, Sophie said, eyes on the water, pretending it was a question tossed to the ducks. I figure the more I talk, he said after a pause, the more likely I'll say something I regret. That sounds like someone who's been hurt. Haven't we all? He replied, not deflecting so much as acknowledging a weather pattern they both recognized. She could have pressed. Instead, she found a smile that didn't hurt to wear. If I ever decided to believe in love again, she said, surprising herself with the word, it would be with someone who knows how to show up without fanfare. He didn't look at her. He just nodded into the kind of silence that holds rather than hollows. That night, on her kitchen counter, Sophie laid the ex-fiance's ring box she'd never opened since returning it to herself. She didn't throw it away. She didn't need a ceremony. She just pushed it gently, decisively to the back of the drawer, behind rubber bands and a measuring spoon. It felt like choosing a street with less traffic. The coincidences weren't coincidences anymore. They were a pattern. And like any pattern, it promised comfort until the day it revealed the thread you hadn't noticed at all. Montreal was turning colder, the kind of damp chill that curled under scarves and made Sophie grateful for every cup of tea she could cradle between her palms. Yet there was one presence that warmed her days in ways she couldn't quite explain. Daniel. He didn't sweep in with roses or orchestrated surprises. He didn't drown her inbox with texts or demand her attention. Instead, he appeared in moments that felt unplanned, subtle, perfectly timed, like the city itself kept stitching their lives together thread by thread. At school, Sophie's students were preparing for the annual book donation drive. The gymnasium was lined with cardboard boxes filled with gently used paperbacks, encyclopedias from decades ago, and stacks of stories waiting for new homes. Sophie had hesitated before telling Daniel about it. She hadn't wanted him to feel obligated. But Saturday morning, there he was, jeans faded, flannel shirt soft from too many washes, arms balancing a large box stamped with the logo of a long-gone Montreal bookstore. He didn't linger at the doorway like someone expecting recognition. He set the box down, crouched, and began organizing books without a word. From across the room, Sophie watched him quietly guide a shy 7th grader toward a shelf. You can pick whichever you like, he told the boy. The boy's eyes widened. Even a 2. Daniel smiled. Especially 2. It wasn't about being noticed. It wasn't about looking generous. He gave in a way that expected nothing in return. And that undid Sophie in ways she hadn't thought possible. Later, in the staff lounge, a colleague nudged her elbow. Who's the guy? The one in flannel who looks like he'd rather wrestle boxes than talk about himself. Sophie laughed under her breath. He's just someone who keeps showing up. The colleague tilted her head knowingly. You don't look like you want him to stop. That evening, Sophie arrived home exhausted, hair damp from sleet. Buster bounded to the door as usual, wagging his tail. She almost didn't notice the faint smell of something warm until the doorbell rang. Daniel stood on the porch, his gray coat damp, a thermos in one hand and a small bag in the other. "Chicken congee," he said simply. "My mom used to swear by it when we were sick. Not pretty, but it works." Sophie hesitated at the doorway. Her hair was a mess, cheeks flushed with fever, and her voice barely more than a whisper. Yet Daniel said nothing about her appearance. He just stepped inside politely, poured the porridge into a bowl, and set it in her lap. "I'll wait outside," he said softly, nodding toward the porch. "Eat while it's hot." She wanted to protest, but the heat of the bowl seeped into her hands, calming her. She ate slowly, listening through the window as Buster settled at Daniel's feet outside. When she peeked out later, Daniel was nodding off on the bench, his head jerking up every few seconds, stubbornly refusing to sleep. Sophie made ginger tea and opened the door. "I don't know how to say thank you," she whispered. "So maybe this will do." He blinked, surprised, then smiled faintly. "Perfect." For a long while, they sat side by side in silence, steam curling into the night air. Sophie realized then that Daniel never tried to fill silence with empty words. Instead, he sat in it with her until it felt less heavy. That night, before bed, she scrolled through her phone's gallery. There it was, the photo she hadn't dared to delete, her in a white dress, beside her ex-fiancé in a tuxedo. A reminder of betrayal, of promises dressed in silk that crumbled overnight. Her finger hovered, trembling. This time, she tapped delete. She didn't even watch it vanish. She simply set the phone aside, her thoughts turning to the man on her porch, the thermos still warm, the smell of ginger still lingering. For the first time in years, Sophie fell asleep not with a memory of loss, but with a presence that felt steady. Someone who didn't demand, didn't press, just showed up. Winter had settled over Montreal like a heavy quilt. Snow pressed down on rooftops, icicles clung to eaves, and the city pulsed with its annual hush. Sophie wrapped herself deeper into her scarf as she crossed St. Laurent, the wind biting at her cheeks. She had grown used to the rhythm of her days now, teaching by morning, grading by afternoon, and somehow always crossing paths with Daniel. It was steady, predictable even. And Sophie, who once flinched at the thought of trusting anyone again, began to crave that steadiness like warmth in the cold, until the night everything changed. Sophie had returned home late from school, a stack of essays weighing down her tote. She made tea, curled into the couch, and turned on the television for background noise, just the hum of another voice, to keep the silence at bay. She wasn't watching, not really, until a phrase snagged her attention. National Forum for Rural Education Development, live from Toronto. She glanced up absently. A man stood at the podium, shoulders squared, voice carrying with quiet authority. His suit was tailored, his tie neat. His words rolled steady, practiced, almost presidential, and Sophie's mug slipped in her hand. It was Daniel. Her Daniel flannel wearing, fence fixing, porridge delivering Daniel stood beneath studio lights, delivering a speech to a national audience. The banner behind him read, Daniel Clarke Foundation, and the chiron at the bottom of the screen spelled it out with brutal clarity, Daniel Clarke, CEO. Sophie froze, heart hammering as his voice filled the room. "We believe every child, no matter their postal code, deserves a library filled with real books and real hope," he said. His tone was steady, commanding. Then, with a flourish of signatures, he pledged $25 million toward rural libraries across Canada. The cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, and the audience erupted in applause. Sophie's tea grew cold in her hands. CEO, philanthropist, millionaire, the man who fixed fences in silence, was the man behind one of Canada's largest education foundations. Her thoughts spun back. Through every moment, the vague answers about supporting schools, the anonymous backpack donation, the note scribbled in neat block letters. The puzzle pieces slammed into place, so obvious now that she wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. And yet, underneath the revelation, another truth clawed at her chest. He had never told her. Not once. The weight of that silence pressed harder than the snow on her rooftop. The next morning, Sophie dragged herself to school in a fog. During free period, a student rushed up, waving a letter. "Miss Tremblay, I got it. The scholarship." Emily's eyes sparkled as she thrust the paper into Sophie's hands. Sophie scanned the letter quickly. Full tuition. Books covered. Awarded by the Daniel Clarke Foundation. No signature. No explanation. Just a phrase scrawled at the bottom. Someone believes in you. Her breath caught. It was him. Of course it was him. The silence stretched between them now like a canyon. He hadn't lied with words, he had lied with omission. He hadn't trusted her enough to share who he was. Not even when he was already in her kitchen, waiting on her porch, feeding stray dogs outside her favorite cafe. That night, Sophie sat at her kitchen table long after Buster curled into sleep at her feet. She stared at her phone, Daniel's name on the screen. She didn't call. She didn't text. She simply deleted the number, her chest aching with a hollow kind of betrayal. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the lie. It was about trust, about whether he had ever truly believed she could love him, without knowing his title, his fortune, his power, for someone who had once been left at the altar by a man whose tuxedo hid secrets sharper than knives. The pain of being left in the dark again was almost unbearable. The next morning, a plain brown package arrived at her door. No return address, just her name in neat handwriting she recognized instantly. Sophie's hands trembled as she carried it to the kitchen table. Hours passed before she untied the twine. Inside lay a worn copy of Letters to a Young Poet, her copy, the one she had given Daniel weeks ago. Inside the cover, folded neatly, was a letter in his hand. She hesitated, then read, "Dear Sophie, I have started this letter a dozen times, torn it up, started again. You once told me that silence can be kinder than explanation. But sometimes silence is just fear dressed as politeness. And I was afraid. Not afraid of what you'd think of me being a CEO. Afraid that if you knew, everything between us would feel bought. When I was 27, I lost everything: my company, my home, my peace. The woman I was supposed to marry left the day the bank froze our accounts. She didn't look back. Since then, I swore if I loved again, it would be as me, not as a name, not as a title. Then I met you, and you made me want to be seen before being recognized. If you never want to see me again, I'll understand. But if even a part of you wonders, I'll be at Maple and Pine on Saturday at 10. No suits, no titles, just me. Because all I've ever wanted is to be loved when I had nothing." Danielle. By the time she finished, Sophie's vision blurred with tears. She pressed the book to her chest, heartbreaking and healing all at once. She didn't know yet if she could forgive him. She didn't know if she was strong enough to step into that cafe again. But she knew one thing: Saturday was coming, and with it, the chance to decide. Saturday morning arrived with a sky the color of steel. Montreal winters had a way of testing resolve. The air sharp enough to make every breath feel like a question. Sophie Tremblay stood at her apartment window long before the church bells tolled 9, staring down at the snowy street, at the trail of salt lines left by passing cars, at the world moving forward as if her own life hadn't been knocked off its axis. On the table behind her, the book still lay where she had left it, Letters to a Young Poet, its spine softened by years, its pages now carrying the weight of Daniel's confession. She had reread the letter 3 times since opening it. Each word tangled her heart tighter. He had been afraid not of her judgment, but of being loved for the wrong reasons. He had wanted to be seen without his title, without the suits, without the foundation that could move mountains with a signature. But hadn't she already seen him? The man who tightened screws on her mother's fence without asking. The man who waited in the cold while she ate chicken congee when fever kept her down. The man who fed stray dogs with crumbs and told shy students to take to books instead of one. That was who he was. Not the CEO on stage. Not the millionaire whose name appeared in headlines. And yet, the betrayal of silence gnawed at her. Trust, once fractured, didn't mend with a single apology. By 9:30, Sophie was at Maple and Pine Cafe, her scarf pulled tight, her heart beating louder than the crunch of snow under her boots. The little bell above the cafe door jingled as she stepped inside. She chose a table near the window, the same one Daniel always sat at. The one where he had first smiled at her across a chipped coffee mug that she ordered chamomile tea. The steam curled upward, and she wrapped her hands around the cup, trying to steady the tremor in her fingers. The minutes dragged, 9-40-5, 9:50, 10 o'clock. Each time the bell above the door rang, her chest clenched. Then, at 10:01, he stepped inside. Daniel Clarke, not the CEO in a tailored suit, but the man she remembered, the worn gray coat, damp from the mist, the familiar crinkled paper bag in his hand. She could already guess what had held biscuits for the golden retriever that lingered near the cafe steps. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room as if the world had shifted and he needed to be sure it was still the same. When his eyes found hers, he froze. For a moment, neither of them smiled. The silence that stretched between them was thick with everything unsaid, everything half-healed. Daniel walked toward her slowly, each step careful, as if afraid the floor might give way. He stopped at the edge of her table but didn't sit. His hands twitched at his sides, betraying nerves that his calm face tried to conceal. "I'm not good at speeches," he said quietly, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "I've said too little when I should have said more, and too much in writing when I should have spoken. But if you still need someone who shows up, someone who listens more than he talks, I'm still here." He set the bag of dog biscuits on the table. He didn't look down, didn't break eye contact. Sophie stared at it for a long moment, then lifted her gaze to meet his. "Thank you," she whispered. He blinked, uncertainty flickering across his face. Was she thanking him for the biscuits? For the letter? For being there at all? He couldn't tell. "You don't have to say anything else," she added, her voice steadying. Then, after a pause that carried the weight of a year's worth of wounds, she said firmly, "But you can't disappear again." A short laugh escaped him, raw and almost joyful. "That's fair." Sophie gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Then sit. You owe me a conversation about why the catcher in the rye is overrated." For the first time since entering, Daniel's shoulders eased. He pulled the chair back slowly and sat. The rhythm they'd once shared slipped back between them like it had been waiting all along. "Only if you promise to defend Jane Eyre with every ounce of your teacher's conviction," he countered. "Always," she replied, raising an eyebrow, and just like that, the air between them softened. It wasn't a reunion sealed with a kiss or an apology wrapped in grand declarations. It was quieter, steadier, the familiar warmth of two people who had learned that love wasn't about perfection or spectacle. It was about showing up, again and again, even after silence, outside the window. Buster sat patiently beside the cafe bench, tail wagging as if he, too, had been waiting for this moment. Inside, Sophie and Daniel leaned into the kind of conversation that needed no conclusion, only continuation. For the first time since she had seen him on that stage, Sophie allowed herself to breathe. Whatever came next, at least they were beginning it honestly, just Sophie and Daniel, no titles, no secrets. The weeks that followed were not marked by fireworks or sudden declarations. Instead, they unfolded in the way snow melts in Montreal, quietly, steadily, almost imperceptibly, until you wake one morning and realize the sidewalks are bare again. For Sophie and Daniel, it was not grand gestures that bridged the silence between them. It was the rhythm of ordinary moments. They met often at Maple and Pine Cafe, their conversations beginning where they had once left off: books, teaching, the quirks of Montreal winters. Daniel never pressed her for forgiveness, never tried to explain himself more than he already had. He simply showed up, his gray coat carrying the faint smell of cold air, his paperbacks tucked under his arm, his calm voice waiting for her when she was ready to speak. Sophie found herself watching him in these small silences, noticing the details she had once overlooked, the way he tapped his thumb against his mug when he was thinking, how his eyes softened when a child walked past with mittens too big for their hands, the quiet humor that crept into his smile when she grew animated about a poem she loved. One evening, after class, Sophie lingered outside the cafe with him. The city was muffled by snow, and the street lamps glowed against the falling flakes. She tugged her scarf tighter. "You know," she said, almost hesitantly, "for a man who runs a foundation, you're terrible at self-promotion." Daniel laughed softly, breath visible in the cold. "I've had enough of promotion. All I want now is presence." She tilted her head, studying him. "And if presence isn't enough for me?" He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze steady but vulnerable. "Then tell me, and I'll walk away. But I won't disappear without a word again. That's a promise." The snow fell between them like punctuation. Sophie didn't reply, not right away. Instead, she slipped her gloved hand into his, the silence between them thick but not heavy. He squeezed gently, as if sealing an unspoken agreement. They began weaving themselves into each other's lives in quieter ways. When Sophie stayed late at school grading essays, Daniel appeared with takeout from her favorite pho place in Chinatown, claiming he had ordered too much. When Daniel spent weekends working at the foundation office, Sophie dropped by with muffins, leaving them at the reception desk without waiting for thanks. One Saturday, they strolled along the frozen paths of Parc Jean-Drapeau, the city skyline shimmering across the river. Sophie stopped to watch skaters twirl across the outdoor rink, their laughter carrying in the crisp air. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Miss what?" "The other life. The one with suits, speeches, cameras." Daniel shook his head, his smile faint but certain. "That was never the life. That was a mask. This," he gestured to the park, to the laughter, to the simplicity of their walk. "This is the life." Her chest tightened, not from doubt, but from the quiet realization that he meant it. But trust, Sophie knew, wasn't rebuilt overnight. Some nights she still woke with the ache of betrayal, remembering the silence he'd kept about who he really was. She wrestled with it in the privacy of her journal, pen scratching across the pages late into the night. And each time she faced Daniel, she wondered if she was strong enough to love someone who had hidden so much. Even if the hiding had come from fear, Daniel seemed to understand without words. He never pushed, never asked where she stood. He simply remained waiting, patient, steady. One snowy evening, Sophie's mother mentioned the front step creaked dangerously. Sophie sighed, adding it to her mental list of chores she'd probably ignore. But the next morning, when she stepped outside, the wood had been replaced, fresh and firm, the smell of pine still lingering. A note sat on the mat. "Step should be good for years now." Sophie held it for a long moment, her throat tightening. She didn't call him. She didn't send a message. She simply tucked the note into her journal. A quiet acknowledgement that sometimes trust was rebuilt not by apologies, but by consistency. Their reunion never exploded into romance like the movies. It was gentler, like sunlight creeping into a room after weeks of gray. They argued about books, teased each other about hockey teams, shared warm bagels on cold mornings, and walked through neighborhoods where no one recognized the man beside her as a CEO. And slowly, Sophie realized she wasn't measuring love by what was hidden anymore. She was measuring it by what was present, by the umbrella pressed into her hands during a storm, by the fence screws tightened without a word, by the man who showed up again and again, even when silence had nearly broken them for the first time in years. Sophie Tremblay allowed herself to believe maybe love didn't need to be loud to be real. Maybe it only needed to stay. A year later, the snow had given way to wildflowers. The little white house in a quiet suburb outside Quebec City stood at the edge of a neighborhood where children's voices carried from the schoolyard across the street. It wasn't grand. No gates, no marble, no staff. Just a small porch, a garden Sophie had planted with her mother, and a wooden swing under an old elm that creaked in the breeze. On the porch sat 2 mugs of coffee, steaming in the cool morning air. Sophie Tremblay leaned back in her chair, hair still damp from her shower, a half-read poetry collection resting on the table. Across from her, Daniel Clarke smiled behind his own mug, sleeves rolled up, stubble shading his jaw. He looked nothing like the man who once stood beneath bright lights in Toronto, pledging millions, and that was exactly how he wanted it. "Another scholarship was awarded yesterday," Sophie said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "That's the 3rd this month." Daniel nodded, gaze drifting toward the school. Children were spilling across the playground, backpacks bouncing, their laughter ringing. "Good," he murmured. "You're never going to let them put your name on the program, are you?" She teased, leaning forward. He shook his head. "I don't need the world to know. Just you." The quiet sincerity in his voice tugged at her. She reached across the table and touched his hand. "I do know." He lifted her fingers and kissed them, gentle and certain. "Then that's enough." Inside the house, Sophie's mother hummed as she folded laundry by the open window. Her health had returned, her energy steadier than Sophie had dared to hope. In the yard, Buster Silver, now around the muzzle but still puppy-spirited, bounded after a butterfly, with the kind of determination that made Daniel laugh every time. The living room was filled with morning light. A record player spun soft jazz from a thrift store find, and Sophie's desk near the window was stacked with essays waiting for red ink. On the corner of that desk, framed in oak, hung the first letter Daniel had ever written to her, the one that had carried him back into her life when silence nearly ended them. Its creases and fading ink told the story of rereading, of forgiveness, of starting over. Beneath the glass, in his looping handwriting, was the line that had become the heart of their life together. She loved me when I had nothing, so now I give her everything, starting with my heart. Beside the frame sat a photo from the school's first book drive, Sophie and Daniel both smiling. Not the stiff smiles of people posing, but the unguarded ones of people who finally felt like they belonged. The house bore the marks of Daniel's clumsy but earnest hands, a fence he had rebuilt board by board, a step he had replaced without waiting for thanks, a garden bed he had dug for Sophie's tulips. He planted tomatoes, burned toast at least once a week, and once painted right over a light switch without noticing. Sophie teased him mercilessly for that one, but every time she did, she looked at him with more affection than words could hold, and he, in turn, loved the way she left notes tucked between the pages of his books, the way she scribbled lesson plans on napkins when inspiration struck, the way she carried her stubborn loyalty like a torch that lit up his darkest corners. One morning, as birdsong wove through the yard, Sophie folded the newspaper again and looked at him with quiet amusement. "Do you realize," she said softly, "that this isn't the life I used to dream of?" Daniel raised a brow. "Should I be worried?" "No," she smiled, eyes bright. "It's better. No grand promises, no perfection. Just mismatched mugs, laughter, quiet mornings, and love that doesn't need to be spoken to be understood." He leaned back, eyes crinkling. "Then I'll keep burning the toast." "Please don't," she laughed, reaching to nudge his arm. "But yes, keep showing up. That's all I ever needed." The screen door creaked open, and her mother stepped onto the porch carrying a tray of fresh scones. Buster barked once, proud of a stick he had dragged across the yard like a trophy. Daniel stood quickly to help, careful as always. Sophie watched him with a warmth that filled her chest, a warmth that came not from wealth or titles, but from the simple truth of a man who had once feared love would come with conditions, yet who found, with her, that it didn't. As the morning stretched, the three of them sat on the porch, sunlight spilling across the table, the smell of scones mingling with coffee. Sophie glanced at Daniel and saw not the CEO the world admired, not the millionaire hidden behind a modest coat, but the man who had shown up in the rain with an umbrella, who had waited outside her door with porridge, who had fed stray dogs with crumbs and students with hope. To people who had been broken by betrayal, by silence, by fear, had found something whole again. Not flashy, not loud, just honest, steady, deeply, wonderfully theirs. And in that quiet corner of Quebec, with laughter spilling from the schoolyard across the street, Sophie Tremblay and Daniel Clarke chose again and again the kind of love that stays.